but there's very much a sense of a pyramid in the world, that the power structure of the world is a pyramid. And at the top, there are these invisible agents. Maybe we're talking there about very rich families. Maybe we're talking about bankers, the banking cartels. Maybe we're talking about an element of Satanism. Literally, almost in the middle of the night, one spring day in March, perhaps, of 2020, or February, late February, perhaps, where we all went to bed in a democratic civilization and woke up in a totalitarian state. COVID was not about COVID. COVID was about everything else except COVID. COVID was not about your health. COVID was about your wealth. The Irish government seems to regard itself now as the facilitator of the de-Irishing of Ireland, which I always intuited to feel like that it was a coalition of forces, and also in a certain sense a machine, like a combine harvester, something like that, which is grinding down the humanity in the world. It's an illusion to believe you can do this by top-down power, and I think he's right in that. They need the people at some level to acquiesce.
Welcome to Discourse with Christian. I'm your host, Christian White, and today's guest is John Waters. John is an Irish thinker, talker, and writer. He's been vocal about his concern for the West, particularly the current state of Ireland and some of the events and things that are going on that I think are relatable, whether you're in Ireland or you're in Europe or you're in Canada, the US, etc. I also wanted to give a shout out to the YouTuber Blue Sky 85 who encouraged me to have John Waters on the show. So, John, it's an honor to have you as a guest today. Thanks for carving out the time.
Thank you very much, Christian. Delighted to be with you.
Well, I figured we'd start off. What's kind of your current macro take on the world at large? Wherever you want to take it, where are you seeing the puck going, so to speak?
Well, I'm deeply alarmed by the global situation and the implications of many of the events that have occurred in the last few years in particular. In that, all my life seemed to take a certain course, and it seemed to be predictable. It seemed to be driven by values of human sovereignty, democracy, constitutional republicanism, and so on. And allied to that then were various ideological battles or differences, but that seems to have really radically altered now, very visibly in the public arena. And I'm not sure, there are different tellings of this, that, this thing goes back a long, long way, many centuries, perhaps. I don't know. It's hard to say. But I've read into that, and it has some plausibility. But it can be difficult to explain that to people, or to persuade people to start to think along that way. And one of the ways I find more useful is to say to people that, isn't it strange that, in recent times, it appears like something like this, that, that up to a certain point, the world was kind of somewhat organic and was being kind of run, particularly the West, it was run along organic lines, free movement, imagination, creativity, capitalism, and so on. All these kind of spontaneous forces sort of built, which are connected to the spontaneity of the human person. And generally speaking, that seemed to be what was driving the world. And it's like some force in the world, let's just say that for the moment, has decided, look, we could do this much better from our own point of view. We could organize, if we were to go back to the beginning, scratch everything and rebuild this system to our liking, as we might have constructed it in the first place. That's my instinct about what's happening, Christian, that there's something of that order happening. Or at least, let us say this. I mean, I kind of, find it useful to give people descriptions, even if they're to some extent speculative, in order to kind of start people thinking, well, does that fit what I see? Does that fit what I feel? Does that fit what's been happening in the world, in my life, in my country? And I think in general, those kind of things, that certainly we have reached or crossed a moment of rupture in our civilization, whereby there's a very clear signs that it is almost deliberately being demolished with a view to building something else. And that we can only speculate about as to what the nature of that something else might be.
Could you dive into, for the audience, who or what those forces are that you suspect?
Well, there you go. It's a tricky one because they don't have faces very much, and there are certain kind of stories, that various theorists have different theories, as you would expect, but there's very much a sense of a pyramid in the world, that the power structure of the world is a pyramid. And at the top, there are these invisible agents. Maybe we're talking there about very rich families. Maybe we're talking about bankers, the banking cartels. Maybe we're talking about an element of Satanism. That's certainly that's the way that people talk about that. And that then there's a kind of a process of devolving power downwards, but on a selective basis. In other words, on a need to know basis. So that, what we're actually maybe in our countries dealing with is not consciously that apparatus at all, but simply some other mechanism, maybe working through supranational organizations like the World Economic Forum, the WHO, the WHO, the World Health Organization. And we've seen a lot of that in the last few years, whereby these and with the pandemic treaty recently being pushed by the WHO, that there's this sense in which that people, that a decision has been made, and that it has become operational. In other words, that there's been no resistance very much to it, or very little of what you might call a political or certainly nothing robust enough to resist it. That is now decided that really the days of bottom-up power are over, and that we're going back to a kind of a neo-feudal view of the world, perhaps even a totalitarian view of the world. I remember a few years ago, and I've mentioned this, there's a gentleman called Mr. Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, the world's biggest asset management company. And he's on record some years ago as saying that democracy is not a very good fit for the kind of capitalism we're going to have going forward. Totalitarianism is better. Now, that's a pretty straightforward and frank statement from somebody who represents some of the richest forces on the planet, many of the richest forces, in fact, pretty much all of the richest forces on the planet. And I think people should pay attention to those kinds of remarks. And I think that there's something there that we need to really sort of think about and to look at, and then to say to ourselves, well, doesn't that accord with the experience of the world since the spring of 2020 and what was called the COVID pandemic? Isn't that the way that our governments behaved, as though overnight being made conscious of this change, of this shift, without us ever being alerted to it? We didn't read in the newspapers, a year before, well, this time next year we're going to revert to Neo-Feudalism, and it'll be a very interesting experiment. Nobody said that, but it started to happen. And it's still happening, as far as I can see. And it may be actually only midway through its first thrust, as it were, because I think that there is more of the same to come, not in the not too distant future. I call this, by the way, for the sake of what I would call simplicity and brevity, I call this force, this group at the top of the pyramid, I call it the Combine, which is a phrase I borrowed from Chief Bromden in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Ken Kesey's novel from the 70s. If people remember that, it was made into a movie with Jack Nicholson as R.P. McMurphy, this maverick, eccentric guy who went into the psychiatric ward and started to cause serious trouble. And the chief was supposedly deaf and dumb. It turned out subsequently that he wasn't quite so deaf or quite so dumb. But he used to say that, there gives it away, he said that he had this sense that the world was being run by a force that nobody could see, and he called it a Combine, which I always intuited to feel like that it was a coalition of forces, and also in a certain sense a machine. Like a combine harvester, something like that, which is grinding down the humanity in the world. And again, I think that there's a certain feel of that in recent years. I really, my recent book, The Abolition of Reality, is about this strange moment that occurred, literally almost in the middle of the night, one spring day in March, perhaps, of 2020, or February, late February, perhaps, where we all went to bed in a democratic civilization and woke up in a totalitarian state.
Yeah, it's very fascinating how much the world has changed since 2020. You know, I look back and look at the mayhem that happened and how people felt pressured to take the vaccine, and how it was just a gradual, I guess, usurpation or kind of takeover, if you will, in some senses, and that things are heating up and continuing to escalate, I should say. I've had guests on the show previously that have alluded to these by the 2030s, we're going to be seeing massive changes, not just as it relates to where the West is, but kind of a reset, whether it's the financial order, social, political, and even in some respects, the rise of obviously some of these BRICS nations like, you know, China and such, and Russia more. As it relates to, I guess, kind of the head of the snake, if you will, would love to kind of dive into that a little more, if you will. I find it interesting. Some have speculated. I've heard some people say people behind the Bank of England that kind of influence Wall Street and over here, even in the U.S., and people behind the Bank of International Settlements. Any further thoughts that you care to share?
I think that there's something in that for certain. I mean, I think, as I said, bankers would seem to be either the ultimate or the penultimate layer of this structure, as far as I can say. And I suppose they're really, you know, as advisors, they're right up there. And it seems that this is about money. I've been saying for some time, in the context of trying to explain what my book is about, which is that COVID was not about COVID. COVID was about everything else except COVID. COVID was not about your health. COVID was about your wealth. And it's a very interesting fact, which not many commentators have remarked upon. A few have, which is that on the 15th of August, 2019, BlackRock issued a bulletin or some kind of memo to the Federal Exchange, to the World Bank, the IMF, and to other basically interested parties, the G20, etc., stating that the world economy was on the point of collapse and needed to be taken down. And I think that was the trigger point for what subsequently happened, because it was a case of really putting the economies of the world into cotton wool and protecting them in order to organize a smooth landing down the road. And what we're moving towards now, by many accounts, is an entirely new form of economy, an entirely new form of money, an entirely new form of social organization, driven by central bank digital currencies, surveillance, social credit systems along the lines which have been brought in already by the Chinese government, and universal basic income, which is a kind of a social welfare for everybody in the context of a world which is perhaps run by AI and doesn't require human labor or involvement. And I've written about this in my book also. And you see that, to me, immediately, people, you see, one of the things that I think Christian people have fallen into is a kind of a fatalism, that when something is announced as a result of what seems to be chronological time and human evolution and the evolution of science particularly, that people sort of shrug and say, well, you know, it's just the way it is, and that's life, you know, and we now won't work anymore. We'll now have to just sit and watch TV or something, or, you know, as Yuval Noah Harari of the World Economic Forum has told us, that we will just take drugs and play video games. The idea is then that the human race will essentially be rendered obsolescent, in effect, by and large. The vast majority. And this implies, of course, that there will be some who will not be obsolescent, who will be running everything, will be in charge, in control. And that the mechanisms of this new world will include surveillance, programmable money, in the sense that it won't be money in any remote sense that we understand money as now, but it will be turnable off, if you like. That if I or you, Christian, bring disfavor, incur the disfavor of the authorities, then we might find that our monthly stipend has been abbreviated or suspended. And that's something that is, I think, a very real danger now, because one of the most striking things about the last 5 years has been the absence of what you would call mainstream opposition in most societies. The opposition has come from the fringes. Um, Somewhat, including myself, I guess you would say. I mean, that we're not, as it were, mainstream people, in the sense that we are not we have no aspirations to be part of the power structure or whatever. And those within the power structure seem to somehow implicitly have understood what was happening as something that they need to get aboard with, and not to question, and not to interrogate, and not to demur from. And I think that's a real sign that this is pretty serious, and this is moving inexorably in a certain direction.
Obviously, CBDCs, greater surveillance, things of that nature has been, mentioned literally by various forces, Davos related forces and such. And there's speculation that these will be able to become effectuated, if you will. Where do you see things ultimately shaking out? Do you see this as being, this is pretty much where we're looking at? And if so, what's kind of the time frame for you? How do you see a means to circumvent that? I know you've mentioned kind of, I believe it is called a velvet revolution.
I don't actually think that it will work. I think it will fail. My great fear is that in failing, it will destroy the world as we know it anyway, and will reduce us back to sort of a primitive way of life. That we will lose all the civilizational values which we have acquired and developed over millennia, really. And that because I don't believe that the people doing this are as omnipotent or as omniscient as their behavior or their instructions or the consequences of their mindset would suggest. And therefore, I think that that's my great fear, that the world will go into a very long period of absolute turmoil. Now, there are, if we move broader from the West, there are signs of some resistance there. But it's ambiguous, I mean, the BRICS business, the China-Russia alliance. These have some potential, I think, for some other kind of thinking to manifest. But, again, from a Western point of view, that's very ambiguous, because these countries traditionally have been, we have looked askance at them, say, at the very least. In some respects, we have regarded them as our enemies. For a long time in the Cold War, Russia was an enemy. Now, I mean, the strange thing is, Christian, that I listen to Vladimir Putin, and he seems to make more sense, certainly when he speaks, than any Western leader, by far. And, I kind of have that sneaky feeling that, I wish if we had a leader of our country who was like Vladimir Putin, we would be much, much better off in these circumstances. On the other hand, I understand that he takes a certain view of the world, and the view of that worldview places Russia at the center. And therefore, we happen to be on the wrong side in that particular perspective. So I am. It is unclear. It is unclear also, I think, the power that these forces, the Combine, have over various entities even the rest. I mean, Trump, for example, it's not clear to me whether Trump is in some sense part of this, or whether he is free from it, or whether he is playing some kind of long game in which he has a cunning plan to somehow resist this. Because I think that Trump's, from insofar as, you see, one of the things that I've been struggling with in the last few years is the kind of amount of discussion in what you might loosely call the resistance about these matters, which tends to become more and more cynical about virtually everything. And therefore, it's almost impossible to talk in an organic way about geopolitics without factoring in the possibility that all of this is theater, which is what they insist. Now, I don't believe that. I insist that I continue to use the apparatus that I've had all my life to try to intuit what is going on, rather than to accept some formulation about, which is what, let's say, a conspiracy theory. I think that it's vital that we have to retain the capacity to look at each other and judge our motivations, our personalities, our demeanors, and so on. And in doing that, and looking at Donald Trump, by and large, I have found him to be, I think, a positive force in the world. There are some, worrisome aspects. The recent business of the Iran attacks and so on. I find that problematic. It certainly goes against what he said he was going to do. And in that sense, you kind of briefly, or maybe not so briefly, start to wonder, has he been got to, or was he fooling us all the time? These are questions that are unresolved for me at the moment. On the other hand, when I look at the kinds of things that he is saying, that J.D. Vance is saying, that even Elon Musk is saying, these are the kinds of things that we in our societies, in our civilization, would have valued, would welcome really with open arms. That's what we would want our leaders to be saying. And the hostility of the other forces in the West, the ones that we have been watching over, say, the last 4 years of the Biden presidency in the United States, they look askance at Trump, and they don't like him, they don't want him, and that's encouraging to me. That those guys find him suspicious. I take comfort from that they don't want him, and that they anathematize him indeed. But at the same time, it's reading these things has become more and more difficult. I find that I watch a lot of geopolitical discussions, and I'm fascinated by them and by the knowledge of the various players involved. But there's always this nagging feeling, yes, but what if all of this is just a puppet show? What if all these people are just moving around the board and are being moved, whether consciously, wittingly, or otherwise, by invisible higher forces? These are things that I think we must look to as possibilities, at least, because there certainly is a high degree of evidence now that there are forces which are in positions of power that are inscrutable insofar as how they work, but seem to be effective. Now, the inscrutability is the question: how do these people persuade those below them on the pyramid to do their will, to do their bidding? There are various theories on this as well, and again, to the uninitiated, these are highly what you might call sensational propositions. The idea that these people that they're using, say, bribery, inducements, blackmail, compromat, all of these things, and that is almost like the mafia is running the world. And that the rest of the political structure is at their mercy and in their total control. And if that is the case, then what we understand about geopolitics has little or no relevance, because the future will be decided not by organic forces but by power exclusively.
Now, as it relates to some of these forces that are kind of behind the scenes, you mentioned on something that I've heard other guests talk about that I've had on the show, and I find it very, very intriguing. You'd mentioned, kind of a Satanistic kind of element, perhaps even like a cabal, if you will. Can you unpack that?
Yes, I do think there's a high probability that that's a force in it. I'm not 100% sure what are the nature of those forces, they seem to have a religious tinge to them sometimes, or an anti-religious tinge maybe, but nevertheless some kind of ritualistic kind of sense of the world. And they seem to have, but at the core of it seems to be the idea that the old idea, because we grew up in worlds that in which the good of humanity was the primary objective of everything. That was at the core of almost everything we learned, everything that we were encouraged to do, to work, to help others, to, create a better world and so on. These were the world peace, even if the aspiration didn't always succeed, it was always there. Now there's a sense in which those aspirations don't even exist anymore. And it seems to me that it has to do with the idea that I think that, the good is hard. The good is slow. You have to, it's a long way around to be honest, to be true, to be truthful, to be fair, to be just. It's a long way around. And I think what has happened is certain these people have discovered in their lives or whatever, that you can take a shortcut by going a route of the darkness, by taking the darker route. And that this has worked for them and that they have succeeded with this. And that actually there is, it's very ironic really for me. I had written a lot over the last couple of decades about Christianity and what had happened to it, and the sense in which Christianity had become implausible in our cultures. I don't mean that it lacks plausibility objectively. I mean that there's something structural within our cultures which makes it hard for people to believe. And that's a complex question. But it seems that at the same time, there were other forces. I mean, the atheism was a huge force in that period, the neo-atheists that we saw from the beginning of the present millennium, roughly, the Richard Dawkins and the Christopher Hitchens, those people. And I engaged with, I remember debating with Christopher Hitchens nearly 20 years ago about this. And but it's and we thought this was kind of something to do with the movement of chronological time. There was even those who believed, like me, I certainly wondered about this. I felt this, and it was something in myself. I had to resist this idea that, well, chronological time is actually, as it were, eradicating the substance of belief itself. Until I began to realize that no, this was built into the culture and the culture made it almost impossible to believe. But what I didn't really think about was that we would arrive out of that period into something which was in another sense a return to the supernatural, a return to a dark mysticism, to a darker mysticism, and that we would actually, in a certain sense, become more uh, of what they would have called superstitious, what the neo-atheists would have called superstitious, and that our cultures would become more like that. That never occurred to me. Never, and yet that's kind of what's happening when you look at various things that are going on. For example, the way that the Islamists are being moved into Western countries. That makes absolutely no sense in terms of the development of those cultures over the last maybe 3,000 years. The presence of Islam is a retrograde phenomenon, clearly, in our cultures, because the purpose of those, clearly when Islam enters a culture, its objective is to take that culture over at some indefinite, maybe non-specific point in the future, and to take it back in time, to take it away from what we would regard as the modern project and so on. Now, some aspects of that that project might be regarded as, when you look at the craziness of the woke phenomenon, for example, you might think, well, yeah, a little bit of a reversion mightn't be such a bad thing. But overall, I don't think it's something that most people in the West, no matter what age they are, certainly the older ones like myself, could possibly, who could anybody think that this was a good idea? And yet it is happening willy-nilly. It is happening everywhere. And nobody, and not alone does nobody seem to be able to do anything about it, but nobody seems to want to do anything about it. or to question it because they're afraid of being called Islamophobics or xenophobics or some other phobics, and as a result, they're actually handing over their countries or their children's countries or their grandchildren's countries to a force that doesn't in any way sympathize with the values that they have held all their lives.
Well, it seems there's some type of certainly a force that has allowed and is intentionally allowing that to happen, which I find fascinating. Over here, I haven't been to Ireland yet. I haven't been to Europe yet, believe it or not. Even though I have a background in the history, more or less, kind of over there. Yeah, I hear about a lot of parts of. I even saw in the news parts of Ireland where it looks, or YouTubers where it doesn't even look like Ireland. It looks like like you're in another country, if you will. Had a neighbor from I don't know if she was from London or she was definitely from the UK. And this was growing up, English neighbor. And she said when she went back, this must have been 15, 20 years ago, she said London is like a totally different place. And yes. I just find it really interesting. I'm obviously out here in California to hear about some of the stuff that's going on.
Well, you see, when you start to scramble around looking for explanations for this, it's very hard to come across them, just to objectively. I mean, the rhetoric of politicians is that it has to do with compassion. We're inviting in the refugees and the asylum seekers from the world who are fleeing war and persecution, But that doesn't stand up for very long. Many of these cultures are not at war. Many of these cultures, insofar as they're at war, they are causing the wars, They are warlike in their whole demeanor. But moreover, when you look at the people who are pretending to be compassionate, you realize that, of course, it is a pretense because they have no compassion for anybody else. Certainly no compassion for their own people in their own countries, because they are totally treating them with total contempt. In Ireland, for example, we have a huge housing list, but it is all Irish people. The Irish people cannot now get houses. Young people have no hope. They have to immigrate to Australia or Canada. And I think that this is very interesting because the concept that I have arrived at as to some extent in a speculative analysis, but it fits this, which is that what is going on is that our countries, the leaders of our countries, are delivering to these unseen forces what you might call vacant possession of their countries. In other words, as when you sell a house, you first thing is the purchaser puts down a deposit, and then the contracts are signed, and on a particular day that is set, you must provide vacant possession, which means that the house is vacated of its people and whatever furniture you wish to keep, and any property or whatever, and you hand the house over on that basis. Now, something similar, I think, is happening in the West. Not literally that the countries are being stripped of their human quotient, but what is actually happening is that there's a serious attempt to ensure that the majorities of the people in all countries will be people who don't care about that country particularly, that they have no affection for that country, no historical relationship with that country, no memory of that country's history, no affection for that country's culture. And that in a certain sense, that a part of this is actually the obliteration of culture. I mean, we had a situation here in Dublin at the weekend, I think Friday or Friday, where Islamists were allowed to march on the GPO in Dublin. Now, the GPO in Dublin is the most historic building in Ireland because it was the site of the 1916 Rising. The revolution that eventually resulted in Ireland obtaining, a form of freedom. Let's just put it like that for the moment. And that was where our great heroes, Pádraig Pearse, James Connolly, etc., where they made a stand against the British occupation forces, and they were executed as a result of that. And that began the process which led to the War of Independence of 1921, and eventually to an agreement that at least the 26 counties would be free of British rule. That's the Republic, what is nowadays known as the Republic of Ireland. So it's to allow this to happen, a march like this. Now, there was a counter demonstration and it was successful, and I congratulate those who participated in it, that they resisted this imposition, this claiming of the shrine of the Irish Revolution. But that's the kind of thing which the authorities are not alone permitting, but actually, I would say, promoting. That is seen what the Irish government seems to want. The Irish government seems to regard itself now as the facilitator of the de-Irishing of Ireland. And I think something like that applies in all other countries as well, but perhaps less so, because I think Ireland, in all modesty, Ireland's history in the world, because of its role, the role of the monks in reclaiming Western civilization at a certain point, the sense of Ireland as a Christian country, an evangelical country in many respects, that is something that the world looks to with great respect. And then again, you see that revolution, that rising of 1916 was a unique rising, which prompted many other revolutions around the world subsequently, including, I'm afraid, the Russian Revolution probably. But at the core of that was a Christian message, because it was based on the idea of self-sacrifice. There was a sense of a crucifixion to be followed by a resurrection, which is precisely what happened. That was the vision that Pádraig Pearse, the leader of that revolution, enunciated. And it seems to me that the combine, the forces seeking to change the world, the last thing they want is patriotism or affection for history or love of country or a sense of belonging, a sense of placefulness, a place that you are connected to metaphysically. They don't want anything like that. They want, as our leader, our supposed leader, Mr. Martin, the leader of the Irish government, so he claims, he says, we want nothing to do with that old-fashioned notion of sovereignty or narrow nationalism. Well, I would like him to tell me what kind of nationalism would he like? If not narrow, then how wide? Because we will make it as wide as he wants and as broad and long as he wants. We don't want any narrow nationalism either. So what he means by narrow nationalism is just nationalism. He doesn't want a nation that is called Ireland. He is seeking to eradicate that nation on behalf of whomever his overlords might be.
So is he kind of like a Mark Carney in a sense?
Oh, yeah. Except he's not as smart, I think, as Mark Carney, in fairness. In fairness to both parties. I think, yes, well, you see, this is another aspect of this, that, and many people who have access to say that there is something in this idea that, we always assume that politicians, people who went into politics, even if we had certain cynicisms about them, that they were idealistic and they wished to do good and they wished to, again, do good, they're good. But then more and more you hear these mutterings about the knock on the door that happens nowadays, when you are elected, and you take up your seat in government or your office, and you're sitting there one day behind your desk trying to sort out your in tray and your out tray, and there's a knock on the door, and in comes somebody that you may or may not know, or a couple of people, maybe a little group, and good afternoon, Mr. White. Congratulations on your appointment, and we'd just like to have a word or two with you about the future. And then they want to explain to you the facts of life, the facts of power, and how it works and how it doesn't work. And that what you actually see then as a result of that is a transformation in the public realm of the person. I mean, we had this many times with our politicians, including Mr. Martin and his predecessor, Mr. Bradker, and or another predecessor, Mr. Harris. All three of those gentlemen, for example, just off the top of my head, were all, when they came into politics, were all pro-life. And overnight they switched to being pro-death in that particular sense. Because now we kill 10,000 babies every year. That's a lot for Ireland, even demographically it's a lot, but it's a lot of death. It's a lot of dead bodies in buckets, which is how I see it. And, that's the kind of thing that has happened more and more in our cultures, I think, whereby you again, going back to that idea that the organic no longer has any dominion or jurisdiction, that it doesn't really matter what is said. It doesn't matter what, asking a politician now what he believes in is a completely fruitless exercise, because he doesn't believe in anything until he's told what to believe in.
So you basically have kind of like a Manchu Quo kind of puppet over there. And it seems that Ireland has been kind of treated as kind of like a backwater. I mean, again, I'm looking at this for, as an American, as someone who in undergrad, studied history. I'm not intimately familiar with the nuances, particularly over in Ireland, but I know for hundreds of years they've been more or less taken advantage of. I know particularly during Cromwell's time when he was over there, and I guess you might call the overlords from London and such. It just seems that people have been kind of dispossessed, and it's just in full on forces are trying to chip at it more and more.
Yeah, that's a very interesting. I mean, it's a very important portion of the picture that we need to maybe briefly touch on. Because yes, Ireland was occupied for 800 years, and by our nearest neighbours, England. We not so much Britain. We, insofar as it wasn't Scotland, it wasn't Wales, it was England, the king, the royal family, and the crown, and so on. But they did occupy us, and Ireland was subjected to a series of genocides, particularly in the 1840s, what are they're colloquially called the famines, but they were orchestrated famines, and because Ireland was the breadbasket of Britain for Britain, there was lots of food, but it was all being exported at gunpoint, except the potato failed, and that was the crop that the Irish population were mainly reliant upon, and we lost something like 2 million people died in that period, and as many more at least immigrated and went to Australia, to America, and to Britain, and Canada, and so on. And of course, this is now used, by the way, by these politicians, these creepy politicians who say, "Well, we went all over the world, therefore we have to take the world back in now by way of repayment." As if that we skipped down to the ports to get on our ancestors skipped to the ports to climb on the death's coffin ships, as they were called, and to take their chances across the Atlantic to see would they make it to the other side. But then you see that really started a process of really almost a dehumanization of Ireland. That we were hemorrhaging our population for most of the last 150 years or more, because 170 years really. I mean, that's. There was kind of like an incontinence, if you like, of humanity in Ireland, that it couldn't hold on, and there was all kinds of couldn't hold on to its own people, and as a result, it was completely losing its capacity to sustain itself, even in independence, and that was a big problem. And so there were many consequences of this. One is that so many people were spread. Irish people were spread all over the world. And in some ways, that was, for those other countries, was a positive thing. Like America, the Irish people were a huge element of the whole development of modern America. But in Ireland, Ireland never really became a going concern. It's almost like, and there seemed to be a dearth of imagination about how to function and how to survive as a country and to become, to realize, to self-realize. And I think this resulted in the modern era in a particular decision being made as to how to do that, which was to basically invite transnational corporations in to Ireland it started off with the chemical industry, which was invited to Ireland really on the basis that, well, we know you're trying to get away from all that new environmental legislation in the United States and so on. But, you know, you can come here and we don't worry about those things, you know. You just come in here and give us a few jobs and we'll be happy, and we'll turn a blind eye to any pollution or anything like that. And that was actually part of the deal that was cut with those companies. But then there were different phases. The financial sector opened up this big international financial services centre in Dublin, in which a lot of activity was moving through, and that tied in with this increasing corporatization of the Irish economy, and particularly when big tech moved in and set up most of its European, pretty much all the European headquarters of those tech companies are in Dublin. And so suddenly Ireland wasn't Ireland insofar as it had its economy, it was not its own. When you read statistics about the Irish economy, which tell you that Ireland is like the second richest country in Europe, or even the world, sometimes they say. I think Luxembourg is supposedly the wealthiest. But that has nothing whatsoever to do with the people who actually live in Ireland. And moreover, you know, that these companies were by and large, the idea of their presence in Ireland was sold on the basis that they would provide employment for Irish people. But of course, they didn't do that. They pretty much brought in their own employees from outside, which resulted in a vast inflow of foreigners, which was really the way that, you know, what is called legal immigration. But it nevertheless happened without any consultation with the people as to would they like their country transformed in this way. And it happened by a process of stealth, really. And so, you know, it is almost, the way I put it sometimes is that, you know, the Irish people, in sometime around the 1950s or early 60s, it was as if we had our representatives, I guess you would say, but the people themselves, in a certain sense, went along with this. That our grandfather had left us a building on the main street with a shop downstairs and an apartment upstairs, and we thought for a long time about, well, what will we sell in the shop, you know? And we would there's a cafe across the street, and we would sit in the cafe looking across at our premises for hours every day, and we think, what could we sell in the shop? And then we had the brilliant idea that, well, why don't we just rent out the shop and live upstairs? And that's pretty much exactly what happened to Ireland. Ireland is not Ireland. Its economy is not Irish. Its culture is being destroyed. Its history has been forgotten. You know, its people are being exported still. While we import the world, we're exporting still our own people, because they can't afford to buy houses in Ireland. They can't get jobs in Ireland that pay their way to live a normal life. And as a result of that, they have no hope of starting families. This is the terrible, terrible catastrophe of Ireland. Which is politicians go around the world boasting about the fact that they've increased the population of Ireland, of the island now, to over 7 million, as if this were some kind of achievement all of itself. What it actually means, Christian, is that, and this is true of every country, I think, this is the philosophy of the modern world. And it's a strange thing that this happened at the end of a period when, you know, we've had the most intensely leftist culture, perhaps in all of history, at a popular level. That we don't any longer that we are now abandoning the whole idea of human endeavor and human caring for the human being, of seeing the purpose of politics and the purpose of human engagement or discussion or media or culture or anything as being primarily directed at the well-being of the people, i.e. the population, and as the indigenous population, so that it doesn't matter, it seems to me, to these guys, it doesn't matter what happens on Ireland so long as business is good. It doesn't matter who's doing that business, so long as the activity on this rock, Thomas Davis, the great Irish patriot, once said, you know, this Ireland of ours is no sandbank. It's an ancient land honoured into antiquity by its valour, its piety, and its suffering. And boy, that is true. But these people care nothing for that. Ireland is just a sandbank to them, and they don't care who walks across it, doing whatever they do. So long as there's some way of turning this into dollars or euros or whatever it is. And so that, in a sense, I think this is emblematic. This is why I think Ireland, you know, is in some sense, I've wrote about this for many years, a petri dish for the future. It has been used as a kind of a laboratory to test out various hypotheses and projects and theories, because, you know, we have a lots of characteristics that make us very interesting in the modern world. One is that we retain the ancient world, the traditional world, for much longer than other countries. And then when we got a sniff of modernity, we grabbed it with both hands and started running for the touchline much faster than everybody else. And it's with the result that we've now passed them all out with all of our bullshit. Pardon my French. But, you know, we have the best gay marriage in the world. You know, we have, you know, we're trying to be the world center of, you know, in vitro fertilization and you know, all of that, basically baby trafficking. That's the ambition of the government, one of the ambitions of the government. They recently brought in a legislation now about human organs, that the population must now opt out of this if they don't want to be carved up after death and their parts sold off to whoever the highest bidder. You actually have to opt out of such a procedure. You know, all of these crazy, well, you see, I won't use words like crazy because those words are no use anymore. They have become redundant because we use them too much when things weren't actually crazy at all, or not very. But now that they're beyond crazy, we have no words to describe what's happening. And this is really the state of Ireland. And I think Ireland, when I talk about Ireland, I understand that Ireland is a small country, and you know, people in bigger countries tend to look at it with a little degree of condescension. But I say to them, Ireland is an emblem, and it is a laboratory for the things that you need to know about. And you need to pay more attention to what's happening to us, because that will be happening to you in a very short time if it hasn't already happened. But Ireland is that kind, because Ireland has, you know, it has literally hemorrhaged its people to the world, and therefore it exists in many dimensions. It exists on this island, and it exists as almost like a human cloud in the world, which is still there and is growing and has a consciousness and a memory, you know, possibly better and stronger now than the memory that exists on the island itself. This is the irony of it. But I appeal to those people to pay more attention to what is happening here, both because we need your help to fight this, but also because you need to be aware for your own country, wherever you are now, that it could be coming to a street near you very, very soon.
Now, would you say most Irish are aware of this, and that they are more, I guess, yeah, for lack of a better word, that they're aware of this, or do you think most of them are still kind of in sleep mode? They're not fully on board, if you will, with what you're...
Oh, no, they're not on board. Most are not aware at all. Most have been cowered, you know, by various forces that have operated in advance of the present phase, which I would describe as the spring of 2020 onwards phase. But before that, we had various referendums. We had, over the previous decade before, we had several key referendums which attacked the fundamental rights section of our constitution. One of this was about marriage, introducing gay marriage. And as I say, we didn't just introduce, say, civil unions or even something called gay marriage. We actually made two men and two women being married the same as a man and a woman. They're constitutionally now regarded as equals and similar and the same and indistinguishable from a couple capable of intrinsically reproducing the child, and so on. So this is an unnecessary and grandiose move. But in my view, it had nothing to do with gay marriage at all. What it had to do with was creating and fomenting an army of attack dogs who could be used to silence people, which is essentially what happened. Because in that referendum, people were told by the LGBT campaigners to keep their mouths shut if they wanted to, escape cancellation, attacks on their reputations. They were told, we can turn your children against you, and so on. And that's essentially what worked like a dream. The Irish people now, who used to be perhaps the most garrulous and argumentative people in the world, are completely numb now and silent and terrified of opening their mouths about anything remotely controversial or anything remotely next door to something controversial or even next door to that. So that they have to rethink through everything that is being talked about and to consider all the implications, lest that in 3 or 4 sentences or 3 or 4 minutes, they might find themselves in the middle of an unpleasant argument and being condemned as, a Somism or, a phobic, homophobe or misogynist or whatever it would be. And that is of course the pattern in the wider West as well. But in Ireland, it's extremely intense because Ireland is so, so intimate, such an intimate culture. We've always had. I mean, we aren't very long from a time when one television program on the national channel, and there was only one national channel, would have half the population watching it at the same time. And everybody would talk about whatever, if there was anything interesting on that, everybody would talk to each other about that for the next week. That doesn't happen anywhere, pretty much anywhere else. It's stopped happening here now, which is actually not a good thing, actually, in a strange way.
Now, as it relates to freedom of speech and things of that nature, I've been hearing that over in the UK, people getting arrested for being vocal, I guess, against the government and such. And over here, like as an American, I think that's absolutely insane to arrest somebody. And I find it just striking how a lot of, I mean, obviously, we just celebrated the 4th of July the other day, how a lot of great thinkers came from, the British Isles, like John Locke, and obviously Montesquieu was over in France. But, some of these other thinkers, and how even in their own countries, they weren't able to see that through, so to speak. Not that it's perfect over here by any stretch of the imagination, but I just think that's crazy how, people getting arrested because they're vocal. They're like, your First Amendment that we have over here, at least, I mean, that could be argued that it's not fully what it is, but how is it over in Ireland?
Oh, it has been terrible, and it was. But in fact, we had a little victory there in the last few years, although the storm may not have passed yet. There was an attempt to bring in what was called a hate speech legislation, which really was going beyond the contents of it. Essentially, what it would mean is that anybody could accuse you of having said something hateful, and all they needed to do to prove it was that they felt aggrieved by it. Not necessarily on their own behalf either. It could be that they felt aggrieved on behalf of some other party, some member of some, group which had protected characteristics under legislation. That was the key phrase: protected characteristics. So this was like a division of the population into those who have protected characteristics and those who do not. In other words, a destruction of the idea of equality before the law, so that somebody could accuse somebody else on the basis of sensitivity or a perceived insensitivity or an imputed insensitivity. And that was only one of the aspects. I mean, this would mean, as a result of this, the police could come in, break into your house, take all your devices, take them away and hold them indefinitely, and refuse to give them back. And not have any particular proof. It was an absolutely astonishing proposal. And when it was so funny because even the word hate was not defined. When politicians were asked to define what meant, they said, well, hate is it's hate. That was the definition. And that was the definition in the legislation. This is, but again, you see, Christian, there's something here that there's so many aspects of this picture that need to be filled in as we go along. But one of the things that happened since 2020 was the destruction of the media. the complete corruption of media, which previously, I was a journalist for 35 years. I was in the Irish Times for most of that time, which was the Irish newspaper of record. It was the most elevated newspaper, the one that all the power, the political sector looked to for discussion and guidance and so on, and indeed all the other media looked to in the same way. And but now we are, because of what happened in 2020, when as a culmination of a series of events relating to the media and its interaction with the internet, that when the internet came along first, newspapers thought they wanted to get in on the act, so they decided that they would set up websites, and they gave away their product for nothing. And organizations like Facebook came in and said, "Oh, thanks very much, we'll take that." And then they started making a lot of money out of that by getting advertising on top of it. So the next thing, the newspaper industry found that it had lost its business model, and it was no longer able to sustain itself. And lo and behold, in 2020, the governments came along and said, "Well, actually, we could help you along here, because we need some help here too. We've got this pandemic to run, and so I'll tell you what, this is the deal. Your business model used to be telling the truth and trying to tell the truth. Fine, yeah, nice, very admirable, but it doesn't really work anymore. So how about telling lies for a change?" And that's what they did. All the newspapers took money to tell lies on behalf of the governments. And as a result of that, we now have a situation where nobody knows what's true. And moreover, that there are no consequences for anything. We've lost all the processes in our democracies whereby accountability was imposed through public ventilation of issues. In other words, and that's gone. So that in the future now, nobody can actually be held accountable unless the political authorities themselves want to make that person accountable. And of course, they usually want to make people they want to make accountable are those who are demanding accountability, because they're known as the far right. They're extremists and domestic terrorists. These bizarre events are happening in our cultures. This is the thing that has struck me so often, Christian, again, to kind of hypothesize about it. It's almost as if time has slipped into reverse, and not just the current moment, but all time. And that we are now, that time has always been going backwards. And in fact, we are all going backwards. Whereas, that we're moving backwards towards 1984, for example, or perhaps we have already reached it. We're already in 1984, which actually was a quite benign year when it happened. But now it's like all of the things that Orwell warned about. And as a result of his warning, we believed at some level that we were inoculated against such events ever happening in our countries. Now we find that we weren't inoculated at all. That his words and his warnings and his scenarios seem to have no effect in our culture anymore. That even when they're being played out almost verbatim, nobody even recognizes, never mind, flashes an ironic smile at the very idea. It's quite bizarre. I didn't think this was possible. What happened in the spring of 2020 was beyond description. That's why I've attempted in this very extensive book of mine, which is 250,000 words, to try to parse and get to the core of it, to drill into the feelings that had brought up in myself and the evolutions that it caused to happen in my brain as I tried to work out how this could happen and what it meant. And I'm still doing that. And I haven't even begun to scratch the surface, I'm sorry to say.
I take it you've been demonized and people have come after you
Yes.
quite a bit.
Oh, yeah. I've had lawfare. I've had abuse in the streets. There's a kind of a Pavlovian thing which the media can now do, which is that they can set a mob on you in a matter of minutes, just by stirring up certain sentiments. I found it's almost amusing. Where I was where I live in Dublin, the first thing they did in the pandemic was that they built a cycle lane right along in front of our house, So half the road, what used to be the road, is now a cycle lane. It's like an Olympic track, and cyclists go up there at vast speeds, incalculable speeds, in full regalia, lycra regalia. And for 2.5 years, those guys, for some reason, in particular those guys, maybe because of the advantage of being able to get away fast, they would shower me with expletives as they passed me in the street. Because I actually, with another former journalist, I had actually taken a challenge to the lockdown in the High Court in Ireland, a process which was done for 2.5 years. So they had plenty of opportunity for, venting in that period. I call them the Lycra lads. They were they've fallen silent in the last couple of years, I must say, but they were pretty active for those first 2.5 to 3 years.
Very spooky. I look back. I was in a previous life. I was working in commercial real estate, and I think about. I'm in my early 30s. I think about how the people I was working with. I had just gotten out of the military. I was just entering this new world of finance, if you will, and how everybody in the office there was like, they're all getting vaccinated, they're all getting this. And I'm like, and having been in the, I was in the Navy, and been in an environment where if you're not conforming, like they're gonna give it to you.
Yeah.
So to speak. And so I felt like shit. Like, I don't want to be like this guy where in the office where like, well, you killed my so and so because you didn't do this. And I look back, and as it has unfolded, what Fauci and all these others proselytized, and as one person said, he should be sent to the Hague for what he's done and what those other groups done. It's absolutely crazy to me.
It is.
And
Yeah, I agree. This is, I don't, you see, one of the reasons, how do I put this? Look, if the normative conditions had persisted, which of course they couldn't have because of the way it was done, but just imagine, like, theoretically, that this is possible, then by now Fauci would be in the Hague, for sure. But it's because that hasn't happened. The conditions which they put in place, in those artificial conditions where there were to be no consequences for wrongdoers of a particular category, and that was pretty much implicit in all that was done. It became impossible to challenge a politician. They were immune from all, impervious to all criticism, impervious to all challenge, and that's still to a high degree true. You even see articles in media. I see them in American media sometimes. Like the Atlantic had an article there recently reviewing the COVID thing, and they were more or less saying that the dissenters had won the argument, but they were still, disparaging anybody who pointed out that the vaccines, so-called, were dangerous or anything like this. So there's this sense of normalization that, they keep talking about this as if the pandemic was every bit as serious as they said on day one, and that it could come back at any time, even though it never actually arrived at all, in truth, really. And so on. So these are utterly bizarre conditions, which again seem to be impossible all my life. In my life in journalism. I mean, journalism was regulated by, above all, the code of in Ireland and in Britain, by the code of conduct as by an organisation called the National Union of Journalists, NUJ, and it was a really good code of conduct. That it required journalists to be making power accountable was your primary objective role in society and so on. But you had to obey certain rules. Like, for example, if you were, interviewing somebody, you had to treat them in a certain way, or, you had to, if you were writing about somebody, then you had to go through a procedure of making all due diligent efforts to contact them and get their side of the story, and so on. All of these things were very expressly set out. And implicit in it too was, when I went to the Irish Times, I mean, back in 1990, I was very much aware that this is a very somber newspaper. I mean, I didn't even go up reading the Irish Times because we had a different kind of household. I mean, it was kind of for slightly, more elevated categories of people, but I was very much aware that this was a really serious paper. And I was told, like, when you go, I even got my hair cut, for the first 6 months when I was in the Irish Times, and I wore a tie for, which I've never, I hardly ever do. But, I had, and yet, and then about 2014, when I was eventually driven out of the Irish Times, it was because my colleagues were on Twitter slagging me off every night for doing my job, for writing columns in which I expressed my truthful opinions about things. And they were calling me all kinds of names and trying to turn mobs on me. And when I contacted the editor, he wouldn't respond to my emails. So that's again, again, we lose language, we lose articulation in the face of such events, because they wouldn't have been imaginable even 3 or 4 years before. That as a result, I think, to a large degree, of Twitter and the kind of the dissolution of standards, the dissolution of protocols, dissolution of convention that resulted from Twitter, that all bets are off now. And that was, again, I think, an orchestrated thing, because it was very vital to the cancellation process of certain problematic figures, including myself, in various cultures, but not just in Ireland, obviously, all over the place. And that was, again, factored into the plan, in my view, which again brings us back to the Combine and the top of the pyramid that you see. There is an intelligence, a very dark intelligence at work in these matters that looks at every detail, and that has really, that's where I think the sense of omniscience and omnipotence comes from. But I think that's probably, I still insist that that's misguided. I don't think they're that smart, really. I just think that they had worked out scientifically a lot of very, very important aspects, and had access to the best minds in relation to things like behavioral sciences and so on, psychology, propaganda. There's a lot in my book about these things, and where they come from and how they work and so on, so that people would be able to recognize these things when they manifest again.
Well, I don't know if you're familiar with Alex Craner. He's someone I've been trying to get on the show.
Well, yeah, I know Alex.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating how he talks about these transnationalists, i.e., these globalists, right? And how they're not even part of any nation state; they're not behind it, and how they have. I'm trying to collect my train of thought here, but how they have been able to usurp and effectuate their agendas, whether that's adding resources on the banker's balance sheet, or doing this, doing that. Very fascinating.
Yes. Yeah, and Alex actually believes that bankers are at the top. I mean, I asked him that express question, and he says the bankers are the top layer, and I think that there's some substance in that, in the sense that, as I say, even if they're not the ones who are calling all the shots, their advice is what's formulating the strategies that are behind all this, because ultimately it will be a financial model of reality at its core, and that it will be about essentially transferring the wealth of the world from the world's population into the pockets and tills and cash boxes of what we rather unfortunately call the elite. Uh, I think that's the plan. That essentially this is a big transfer. There's a chapter in my book about another book which came out about 2 years ago, which is really important, I think, called The Great Taking by David Rogers Webb. It's a brilliant book, a very scary book, because he goes into some detail about what they've actually done to achieve this great taking, and it's basically that when the chips all come down, we'll all find ourselves penniless and dependent and mendicant and obsolete and so on. And I think that's probably true, I'm sorry to say, but that I think that we're in for a time when most of us will be baffled by what is actually happening in front of our eyes or into our ears in the morning, so to hear the news. But I think that's coming, and that really then is the question: is the whole world going to just knuckle down and accept this new dispensation? or are we going to find some, gumption and say no, it's not happening? Because you see, that's another thing Alex says, and he's so right. He says they can't do that. It's an illusion to believe you can do this by top-down power, and I think he's right in that. They need the people at some level to acquiesce, to go along. And if they can't achieve that, then they can't do it. And I think that's absolutely right. Because all of this, what we've seen in since 2020, has that aspect visible, very much visible in it, that it's all about manipulation of people and getting people to become proxies of the government in terms of enforcing its will, so that they don't even need to have the laws. They claim to have certain laws, but these are very suspect. I mean, in the programs of laws that brought in most European Western countries in 2020 were really, I think, they were really almost sleights of hand, because really they were implying that they had all of these capacities, all of these entitlements to do all certain things, but they never needed to do them because they got the ordinary citizen to police each other and enforce these rules in ways that they weren't able to, that the people weren't even able to understand what's happening. And so it was, again, a very clever set of tricks. And they even went through all the rituals of dragging people into court. But in most cases, the cases they were dismissed or, dealt with, fudged in some way.
Now, as it relates to, kind of the globalists, if you will, the Davos crowd and such, and also the state of society, which, it very much appears that the West is in decline, continued in decline. I mean, part of that is predicated on the economics of it, right? Which, whereby inflation has really eroded much of the purchasing power of people across the West, if you will. And, okay, there we go. We're back. They're trying to take us out, John.
I think we're becoming way too coherent for our own good, Christian.
I want to, I want to be respectful of your time and such. But I figured, I know we cut off there, but I'll just get back to the question here.
Yeah, do that, Jake. That's a good, yeah.
Okay. So here, it's still going. I can always edit this. As it relates to the transnationalists, if you will, kind of globalists, obviously so much of it ties in with the economy and such. Some have said that because of the West's decline, economically, and the massive debts that obviously impede things, that they need a means to extricate themselves, whether that's through a war with BRICS, as we were seeing with Russia, Ukraine, or in the Middle East, if you will. Do you subscribe to that? I mean, or what are your thoughts on that? That war is really their only way out because they can't default.
Yes,
or won't, I should say.
That does seem to be the case. In fact, I felt that immediately. I wrote an article back in February 22 when the Ukraine war broke out, and it was headlined "Any war will do." And it seemed to me that that's exactly, given the state of the world, the currencies of the world, the economies of the world, the level of debt, that they need to actually, reboot. And a war is the perfect way, because the war will erase memories. It will wear priorities. That you can get away with all kinds of things when you can say, well, there's a war on. So everything is forgotten. It's almost like the blackboard is completely cleared, and all bets are off. And by the time the war is over, nobody remembers what their grievance was at the beginning. And I think there's all that at play. What's puzzling in that context, though, is that they're also at the same time preparing all the other instruments as though we're going into a period of peace. It presumably, the whole CBDC thing. Well, maybe they can work it, they can operate it just as well in a war context. But it's going to be pretty hard when in the midst of a chaos like a global war to introduce those kind of very radical instruments. So I'm not sure how that fits together. Maybe it's a kind of a belt and braces strategy, that they just want to kind of make sure that they have every option covered. But I do certainly think that, you know, the bellicosity of the world's political elite, so to speak, has increased exponentially in the last few years, particularly in Europe. I mean, the European leaders seem to be just gaga for conflict with someone or other. They don't seem to care who they fight. They'll fight everybody or anybody. And Britain in particular, but also Germany, Ursula von der Leyen, all these people, like, you know, who won't be on the battlefields, you know, really keen to get the young men of the world out onto the battlefield and get killed. And I think we've seen quite enough of that in the last few years in Ukraine. I mean, it's been absolutely shocking, but unbelief, the level of carnage in that conflict. For no purpose whatsoever that one can see, you know, except to provoke exactly that. So that's a very dismal scenario, and I'm not sure how the BRICS phenomenon will address that or become bound up in it. I, as I say, I think, you know, there's a great deal more prudence to be seen among those leaders than there is in the West, leaving Trump out of it. And I say I have mixed feelings about Trump at the moment. But you know, I kind of thought I thought that the great thing about Trump was that he was old, older than me, you know, which is quite old, and he's 79 now, and or so anyway, and like he's got nothing to lose. You'd imagine that he would basically kill those guys to get stuffed, and just get on with running America in a way that, you know, he said he would, which is quite a constructive program, and mounting almost to a new ideology or a rebooted ideology of, you know, what you might call classical liberalism with a little bit of neoliberalism mixed in, and yet now at this moment it's not clear, but you know, we are in the West, and and that's the strange situation we're in, that we are dependent on our own leaders to do the right thing, to have capacities to think and to protect their own peoples and so on. And I don't see very much of that coming from any quarter in the West in the last few years. Trump was about the only one, really. Putin in his own corner, but you know, Putin isn't he's not our man, you know, and that leaves me in a very kind of, you know, despondent state, really, because much as one might say, well, we would like a leader like Putin, we wouldn't want Putin to come out on top in this, because our lives would not improve as a consequence of that, I don't think.
John, is there anything else that you'd like to share with the audience? Perhaps anything that you feel doesn't receive enough attention, or any parting wisdom?
Well, I would say this, Christian, that what has alarmed me more than anything in the last few years is the capacity of political establishments to manipulate large numbers of people using behavioral sciences and tricks and propaganda and all those things. And these are lethal instruments, you know, particularly we saw that in the COVID episode, the way they were able to tap into people's consciousness. I mean, one of the chapters in my book is about the way that they, and this, I haven't seen this anywhere else, but it's a theory of mine, which I think has a lot of substance, that they managed above all to tap into the play instinct of the human, which is a very, very predominant instinct in humanity and also in animals of various kinds. And by that I mean that they managed to at some subliminal level of consciousness to convey to people that what they were engaged in was a game, and that for that reason they needed to follow the rules. And therefore they could get them to follow any rule that they came up with, no matter how ludicrous or senseless or whatever. And the way I talk about it and say, well, okay, so the game involves, walking into a room wearing a face covering, and you have to wear the face covering so long as you're standing up. But as soon as you sit down, you can take the face covering off. And if you want to go to the bar, you have to put it on, and then you can go up. But as soon as you get the drink in your hand, you're permitted to take off the face covering as well. And this sounds completely absurd as a game, but the people of the world did that for 2 years, not that long ago, without questioning it. Even though the many people were talking about these face covering and saying they had no use whatsoever, that they were actually harmful to people's health. And nobody could get into the center of the public square to make this point clearly and to make it stick. And so that worries me greatly about the capacity of political elites now to access the public mentality, the mindset of the public, and impose on it, without any coercion, it seems, without or at least coercion in the normal understanding of that term, their will. And that's even before you get into the AI era, because then, that's an extension of that. And of course, that's the destination of much of this in a mechanical sense. Like, the future of the human race is to be part of a machine. And that machine will be the technocracy of society, and you will have a part on it so long as you're prepared to play that part in full. But as soon as you say, no, I don't want to do it, then, well, who knows what will happen to you? And, all these things crept up on the human race without their vigilance being employed to even pay attention. I remember like back in the 80s, I talked about this quite a lot, that I was an editor of somewhat left-wing magazines. And at that time, there was an awful lot of talk about the future of work and the future of humanity under various headings in that context, like to do with, obviously income, but also dignity, the dignity of the individual in reality. How do you maintain after such a long period of civilization in which people were regarded and judged by their occupations and the status in that sense, how do you then, how do you restore dignity to the human person? I talked about something they call a redistribution of dignity, the necessity for that. And but something happened there sometime around the late 80s, early 90s. And what actually happened was prosperity, or at least what seemed to be prosperity, which created starting from the post-Reagan boom in the United States. It spread this wave of prosperity across the West into Europe. And in Ireland, it arrived even in Ireland in the late 90s, and it was called the Celtic Tiger. And what happened then, Christian, was that everybody forgot about everything that had appeared to be problematic up to hitherto. In other words, we didn't have any problems anymore, and anybody who talked about problems was some kind of, Jeremiah who needed to be silenced. So you couldn't question anything fundamentally anymore, because we were all rich, weren't we? And then that went on for 20 years or so. Well, maybe not 20, maybe about 12, 15. And then it collapsed. And then we had about 10 years of recrimination and naming, blaming, shaming. And then suddenly we woke up one day and we had people like Henry Kissinger telling us that the future of humanity had been decided. The plan was all worked out. And we needn't worry our pretty little heads anymore, because we would just be told what was going to happen, and we would just keep our mouth shut and get on with it. And that was the beginning of the post-humanist phase, really. Because Kissinger published a book about that about 3-4 years ago. He's dead now, a couple of years. But it was I think it was his last book with 2 other guys. And 2 tech guys. And it was a very interesting book in this sense, that it was clearly a manifesto for the future of humanity. It wasn't a set of propositions for debate. It was like, here's the deal. And so that all of the most important, so this, the most important kind of event in the history of humanity, you know, setting us up for absorption into the machine. It's pretty radical. It had happened without any intervention, any democratic intervention whatsoever. It all had been sorted out in Silicon Valley and such places. And that's something that I think that even now we might still be able to address if we had the people in power and in thought. You know, one of the great terrible things I think that's happened in the last few years as well is the complete abdication of the artistic community. You know, like poets and painters used to be the part of the conscience of human society, but they've fallen silent in the most, I think, terrifying period that we've ever experienced in Western civilization. They have nothing to say to these questions. Why is that? Well, it's partly because of the nature of the sponsorship of art and literature, that they're dependent, they too are dependent on handouts from governments. I'm sorry to say that because, you know, we're talking here about the great minds, the great souls, the great hearts of humanity. But I'm sorry to say that they have fallen asleep at the wheel.
I was going to comment. I do have some speculation that there might be a revitalization of the arts in some respects, perhaps in the future, as AI and as technology becomes more entrenched in our daily lives. There's going to be a greater premium, and this isn't coming from me, this is coming from others who've spoken about it, that there's going to be a greater premium placed on the human expression, whether that's, you know, things that are artistic, things that are handmade, and of course I surmise that things that are quantitative in nature will be the first to go, or potentially go, in a sense. And also wanted to mention, you mentioned about how you know, artists and poets and things of that like have been kind of around the consciousness, and you know, obviously with having you on, reminds me of some of the great Irish thinkers and such over the past millennia plus. And there, you know, I was just going to make a comment, or more of an observation, John, that I feel like there is some correlation between having some idle time, you know, having a little bit of margin in the day to be able to ideate, to do things that aren't just focused on one's survival and like great ideas. And how, I guess in some ways, especially now with where inflation is, people are having to do 2-3 jobs, governments lie about where things are at, or inflation, or this, that, and the other. And I'm kind of going off, but I just want
No, I think I hear what you're saying, Christian, and I certainly share your hopes. You know, that something like that will happen, and I won't say anything at this moment to darken that prospect, because, you know, the human heart is hungry for reality, and if we can take away the blocks, and once it has nothing to lose. Once the human has nothing to lose, and I think that's unfortunately where we're going. In a sense, unfortunately, in a sense, fortunately, because we need to go to the point where there's nothing to lose. I mean, it's almost like the alcoholic, you know, that we have to hit rock bottom in terms of our hopes for our futures and our children's futures before we actually start a process of fighting back. And I do think in that time that the artists will awaken. Because, and they will realize, well, look, there's no future for anybody unless we go back to doing what we were, you know, what we were intended, what we were meant to do. And so I'm hopeful of that. But you know, at the moment it's bleak, because, you know, everybody thinks they have something to lose by keeping their mouth shut. You know, and that's by saying something, I mean, and that they better keep their mouth shut. And I think we need that that period to come to a close before we actually see any movement.
It's definitely kind of fourth turning stuff. Great reset, and that seems like that is going to be the case within the coming years. John, wanted to thank you, of course, for your time. It's been an honor. How can people learn more about you and get in touch with you, John?
Well, really, my Substack is my sole platform, really. Johnwaters.substack.com, or John Waters Unchained. People will find me there. I'm on Twitter, but in a very tokenistic way at the moment, because I was very much set against Twitter for a long time. I was persuaded last year when Elon Musk took over to give it a shot. I didn't really find it all that satisfactory because I think I'm still shadow banned. I don't think Elon has arrived in Dublin yet with his whip. So I'm still I was it wasn't really working for me, but I'm on there anyway. John Waters 2024 is my whatever you would call it handle, and I occasionally do tweet things. Maybe I'll get a fit in the next few months again and start putting some more thought into it and having another go. But on by and large, I mean my reach is very 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 short, and so I don't bother too much with it. But maybe people, if they want, they can just try and click on there and follow me and see if I wake up.
Absolutely. Well, John, thanks again for being on, and I hope to have you on later this year.
Thank you very much, Christian. It's been a real pleasure, and lovely to see you and talk to you.
Quick ask. Over half of you who watch the show regularly haven't yet subscribed. If you've enjoyed the show, you're finding value in it, subscribing is really the best way to support the channel. It's, of course, free. It literally takes 2 seconds, and it lets the algorithm know that this content matters. And, of course, my commitment to you is going to be that I'm going to continue to bring on great guests, refine those questions. And of course, I'm always receptive to your feedback. If there's certain people that you'd like to have on, or certain questions, or this, that, and the other that you'd like to have as part of the show going forward, things of that nature, please let me know. I'm pretty easy to access. Anyhow, that's my commitment to you. If you can subscribe, that would mean a lot. Thanks.